It compelled attention for a space, for all earthly concentration of mind. I could but stare at it for a moment with a vague anticipation that, after all, in some way so strange and glorious an object must have significance, could not possibly be a matter of absolute indifference to the scheme and values of my life. But how? I thought of Parload. I thought of the panic and uneasiness that was spreading in this very matter, and the assurances of scientific men that the thing weighed so little, at the utmost a few hundred tons of thinly diffused gas and dust, and that even were it to smite this earth fully, nothing could possibly ensue. And after all, said I, what earthly significance has anyone found in the stars? Then, as one still descended, the houses and buildings rose up, the presence of those watching groups of people, the tension of the situation, and one forgot the sky. Preoccupied with myself and the dark dream about Nettie and my honor, I threaded my course through the stagnating threat of this gathering, and was caught unawares, when suddenly the whole scene flashed into drama. The attention of everyone swung round with an irresistible magnetism towards the high street, and caught me as a rush of waters might catch a wisp of hay. Abruptly, the whole crowd was sounding one note. It was not a word. It was a sound that mingled threat and protest, something between a prolonged ah and ugh. Then, with a hoarse intensity of anger, came a low, heavy booing. Boo! Boo! Ooh! A note stupidly expressive of animal savagery. Toot! Toot! Said Lord Redcar's automobile in ridiculous repartee. Toot! Toot! One heard it whizzing and throbbing as the crowd obliged it to slow down. Everybody seemed in motion towards the colliery gates, I too, with the others. I heard a shout. Through the dark figures about me, I saw the motor car stop and move forward again, and had a glimpse of something writhing on the ground. It was alleged afterwards that Lord Redcar was driving, and that he quite deliberately knocked down a little boy who would not get out of his way. It is asserted with equal confidence that the boy was a man who tried to pass across the front of the motor car as it came slowly through the crowd, who escaped by a hair's breadth, and then slipped on the tram rail and fell down. I have both accounts set forth, under screaming headlines, in 2 of these seer newspapers upon my desk. No one could ever ascertain the truth. Indeed, in such a blind tumult of passion, could there be any truth? There was a rush forward, the horn of the car sounded, everything swayed violently to the right for perhaps 10 yards or so, and there was a report like a pistol shot. For a moment everyone seemed running away. A woman carrying a shawl-wrapped child blundered into me and sent me reeling back. Everyone thought of firearms, but as a matter of fact, something had gone wrong with the motor. What in those old-fashioned contrivances was called a backfire. A thin puff of bluish smoke hung in the air behind the thing. The majority of the people scattered back in a disorderly fashion, and left a clear space about the struggle that centered upon the motor car. The man or boy who had fallen was lying on the ground with no one near him, a black lump, an extended arm and 2 sprawling feet. The motor car had stopped and its 3 occupants were standing up. 6 or 7 black figures surrounded the car and appeared to be holding onto it as if preventing it from starting again. One, it was Mitchell, a well-known labor leader, argued in fierce low tones with Lord Redcar. I could not hear anything they said. I was not near enough. Behind me, the colliery gates were open, and there was a sense of help coming to the motor car from that direction. There was an unoccupied muddy space for 50 yards, perhaps, between car and gate, and then the wheels and head of the pit rose black against the sky. I was one of a rude semicircle of people that hung as yet indeterminate in action about this dispute. It was natural, I suppose, that my fingers should be closed upon the revolver in my pocket. I advanced with the vaguest intentions in the world, and not so quickly but that several men hurried past me to join the little knot holding the car. Lord Redcar, in his big furry overcoat, towered up over the group about him. His gestures were free and threatening, and his voice loud. He made a fine figure there, I must admit. He was a big, fair, handsome young man with a fine tenor voice and an instinct for gallant effect. My eyes were drawn to him at first wholly. He seemed a symbol, a triumphant symbol, of all that the theory of aristocracy claims, of all that filled my soul with resentment. His chauffeur sat crouched together, peering at the crowd under his lordship's arm. But Mitchell showed as a sturdy figure also, and his voice was firm and loud. "You've hurt that lad," said Mitchell, over and over again. "You'll wait here till you see if he's hurt." "I'll wait here or not, as I please," said Redcar, and to the chauffeur, "Here, get down and look at it." "You'd better not get down," said Mitchell, and the chauffeur stood bent and hesitating on the step. The man on the back seat stood up, leant forward and spoke to Lord Redcar, and for the first time my attention was drawn to him. It was young Verrall. His handsome face shone clear and fine in the green pallor of the comet. I ceased to hear the quarrel that was raising the voice of Mitchell and Lord Redcar. This new fact sent them spinning into the background. Young Verrall. It was my own purpose coming to meet me halfway. There was to be a fight here. It seemed certain to come to a scuffle, and here we were. What was I to do? I thought very swiftly. Unless my memory cheats me, I acted with swift decision. My hand tightened on my revolver, and then I remembered it was unloaded. I had thought my course out in an instant. I turned round and pushed my way out of the angry crowd that was now surging back towards the motor car. It would be quiet and out of sight, I thought, among the dump heaps across the road, and there I might load unobserved. A big young man, striding forward with his fists clenched, halted for 1 second at the sight of me. "What?" said he. "Ain't afraid of him, are you?" I glanced over my shoulder and back at him, was near showing him my pistol, and the expression changed in his eyes. He hung perplexed at me. Then, with a grunt, he went on. I heard the voices growing loud and sharp behind me. I hesitated, half turned towards the dispute, then set off running towards the heaps. Some instinct told me not to be detected loading. It was cool enough, therefore, to think of the aftermath of the thing I meant to do. I looked back once again towards the swaying discussion, or was it a fight now? And then I dropped into the hollow, knelt among the weeds, and loaded with eager, trembling fingers. I loaded one chamber, got up, and went back a dozen paces, thought of possibilities, vacillated, returned, and loaded all the others. I did it slowly because I felt a little clumsy. And at the end came a moment of inspection. Had I forgotten anything? And then for a few seconds I crouched before I rose, resisting the first gust of reaction against my impulse. I took thought, and for a moment that great green-white meteor overhead swam back into my conscious mind. For the first time, then, I linked it clearly with all the fierce violence that had crept into human life. I joined up that with what I meant to do. I was going to shoot young Verrall, as it were, under the benediction of that green glare. But about Nettie? I found it impossible to think out that obvious complication. I came up over the heap again and walked slowly back towards the wrangle. Of course I had to kill him. Now I would have you believe I did not want to murder young Verrall at all at that particular time. I had not pictured such circumstances as these. I had never thought of him in connection with Lord Redcar and our black industrial world. He was in that distant, other world of Chex Hill, the world of parks and gardens, the world of sunlit emotions and Nettie. His appearance here was disconcerting. I was taken by surprise. I was too tired and hungry to think clearly, and the hard implication of our antagonism prevailed with me. In the tumult of my past emotions, I had thought constantly of conflicts, confrontations, deeds of violence, and now the memory of these things took possession of me as though they were irrevocable resolutions. There was a sharp exclamation, the shriek of a woman, and the crowd came surging back. The fight had begun. Lord Redcar, I believe, had jumped down from his car and felled Mitchell, and men were already running out to his assistance from the colliery gates. I had some difficulty in shoving through the crowd. I can still remember very vividly being jammed at one time between two big men, so that my arms were pinned to my sides, but all the other details are gone out of my mind until I found myself almost violently projected forward into the scrap. I blundered against the corner of the motor car and came round it face to face with young Verrall, who was descending from the back compartment. His face was touched with orange from the automobile's big lamps, which conflicted with the shadows of the Comet light and distorted him oddly. That effect lasted but an instant, but it put me out. Then he came a step forward, and the ruddy lights and queerness vanished. I don't think he recognized me, but he perceived immediately I meant attacking. He struck out at once at me, a haphazard blow, and touched me on the cheek. Instinctively, I let go of the pistol and snatched my right hand out of my pocket and brought it up in a belated parry, and then let out with my left full in his chest. I sent him staggering, and as he went back, I saw recognition mingle with astonishment in his face. "You know me, you swine," I cried and hit again. Then I was spinning sideways, half stunned, with a huge lump of fist under my jaw. I had an impression of Lord Redcar as a great furry bulk, towering like some Homeric hero above the fray. I went down before him. I made him seem to rush up, and he ignored me further. His big, flat voice counseled young Verral. "Cut, Teddy, it won't do. The Picketas got in a baz." Feet swayed about me, and some hobnailed miner kicked my ankle and went stumbling. There were shouts and curses, and then everything had swept past me. I rolled over on my face and beheld the chauffeur, young Verral, and Lord Redcar, the latter holding up his long skirts of fur and making a grotesque figure in one behind the other, in full bolt across a coldly comet-lit interval, towards the open gates of the colliery. I raised myself up on my hands. Young Verral! I had not even drawn my revolver. I had forgotten it. I was covered with coaly mud. Knees, elbows, shoulders, back. I had not even drawn my revolver. A feeling of ridiculous impotence overwhelmed me. I struggled painfully to my feet. I hesitated for a moment towards the gates of the colliery and then went limping homeward, thwarted, painful, confused, and ashamed. I had not the heart nor desire to help in the wrecking and burning of Lord Redcar's motor. Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 4. In the night, fever, pain, fatigue, it may be the indigestion of my supper of bread and cheese, roused me at last out of a haggard sleep to face despair. I was a soul lost amidst desolations and shame, dishonored, evilly treated, hopeless. I raged against the God I denied, and cursed him as I lay. And it was in the nature of my fever, which was indeed only half fatigue and illness, and the rest the disorder of passionate youth, that Nettie, a strangely distorted Nettie, should come through the brief dreams that marked the exhaustions of that vigil to dominate my misery. I was sensible, with an exaggerated distinctness, of the intensity of her physical charm for me, of her every grace and beauty. She took to herself the whole gamut of desire in me and the whole gamut of pride. She, bodily, was my lost honor. It was not only loss but disgrace to lose her. She stood for life in all that was denied. She mocked me as a creature of failure and defeat. My spirit raised itself towards her. And then the bruise upon my jaw glowed with a dull heat, and I rolled in the mud again before my rivals. There were times when something near madness took me, and I gnashed my teeth and dug my nails into my hands, and ceased to curse and cry out only by reason of the insufficiency of words. And once, towards dawn, I got out of bed, and sat by my looking-glass with my revolver loaded in my hand. I stood up at last and carefully put it in my drawer and locked it, out of reach of any gusty impulse. After that I slept for a little while. Such nights were nothing rare and strange in that old order of the world. Never a city, never a night the whole year round, but amidst those who sleep were those who waked, plumbing the deeps of wrath and misery. Countless thousands were so ill, so troubled, they agonized near to the very borderline of madness, each one the center of a universe darkened and lost. The next day I spent in gloomy lethargy. I had intended to go to Check's Hill that day, but my bruised ankle was too swollen for that to be possible. I sat indoors in the ill-lit downstairs kitchen with my foot bandaged, and mused darkly and read. My dear old mother waited on me, and her brown eyes watched me and wondered at my black silences, my frowning preoccupations. I had not told her how it was my ankle came to be bruised and my clothes muddy. She had brushed my clothes in the morning before I got up. Ah, well, mothers are not treated in that way now. That I suppose must console me. I wonder how far you will be able to picture that dark, grimy, untidy room with its bare deal table, its tattered wallpaper, the saucepans and kettle on the narrow, cheap, but by no means economical range, the ashes under the fireplace, the rust-spotted steel fender on which my bandaged feet rested. I wonder how near you can come to seeing the scowling, pale-faced hobbledehoy I was, unshaven and collarless in the Windsor chair, and the little timid, dirty, devoted old woman who hovered about me with love peering out from her puckered eyelids. When she went out to buy some vegetables, in the middle of the morning, she had got me a halfpenny journal. It was just such a one as these upon my desk, only that the copy I read was damp from the press, and these are so dry and brittle, they crack if I touch them. I have a copy of the actual issue I read that morning. It was a paper called emphatically The New Paper. but everybody brought it and everybody called it the yell. It was full that morning of stupendous news and still more stupendous headlines, so stupendous that for a little while I was roused from my egotistical broodings to wider interests, for it seemed that Germany and England were on the brink of war. Of all the monstrous irrational phenomena of the former time, war was certainly the most strikingly insane. In reality, it was probably far less mischievous than such quieter evil as, for example, the general acquiescence in the private ownership of land, but its evil consequences showed so plainly that even in those days of stifling confusion one marveled at it. On no conceivable grounds was there any sense in modern war, save for the slaughter and mangling of a multitude of people, the destruction of vast quantities of material, and the waste of innumerable units of energy. It affected nothing. The old war of savage and barbaric nations did at least change humanity. You assumed yourselves to be a superior tribe in physique and discipline. You demonstrated this upon your neighbors, and if successful, you took their land and their women and perpetuated and enlarged your superiority. The new war changed nothing but the color of maps, the design of postage stamps, and the relationship of a few accidentally conspicuous individuals. In one of the last of these international epileptic fits, for example, the English, with much dysentery and bad poetry, and a few hundred deaths in battle, conquered the South African Boers at a gross cost of about £3,000 per head, that they could have bought the whole of that preposterous imitation of a nation for a tenth of that sum. And except for a few substitutions of personalities, this group of partially corrupt officials in the place of that, and so the fourth, the permanent change was altogether insignificant. But an excitable young man in Austria committed suicide when at length the Transvaal ceased to be a nation. Men went through the seat of that war after it was all over and found humanity unchanged, except for a general impoverishment and the convenience of an unlimited supply of empty ration tins and barbed wire and cartridge cases, unchanged and resuming, with a slight perplexity, all its old habits and misunderstandings, the nigger still in his slum-like crawl, the white in his ugly ill-managed shanty. But we in England saw all these things, or did not see them, through the mirage of the new paper, in a light of mania. All my adolescence from 14 to 17 went to the music of that monstrous resonating futility, the cheering, the anxieties, the songs and the waving of flags, the wrongs of generous Buller and the glorious heroism of De Wet, who always got away. That was the great point about the heroic De Wet, and it never occurred to us that the total population we fought against was less than half the number of those who lived cramped ignoble lives within the compass of the four towns. But before and after that stupid conflict of stupidities, a greater antagonism was coming into being, was slowly and quietly defining itself as a thing inevitable, sinking now a little out of attention only to resume more emphatically, now flashing into some acute definitive expression, and now percolating and pervading some new region of thought, and that was the antagonism of Germany and Great Britain. When I think of that growing proportion of readers who belong entirely to the new order, who are growing up with only the vaguest early memories of the old world, I find the greatest difficulty in writing down the unintelligible confusions that were matter of fact to their fathers. Here we are, we British, 41 millions of people in a state of almost indescribably aimless economic and moral muddle that we had neither the courage, the energy, nor the intelligence to improve, that most of us had hardly the courage to think about, and with our affairs hopelessly entangled with the entirely different confusions of 350 million other persons scattered about the globe, and here were the Germans over against us, 56 millions, in a state of confusion no whit better than our own. And the noisy little creatures who directed papers and wrote books and gave lectures, and generally, in that time of world dementia, pretended to be the national mind, were busy in both countries, with a sort of infernal unanimity, exhorting, and not only exhorting, but successfully persuading, the two peoples to divert such common store of material, moral, and intellectual energy as either possessed, into the purely destructive and wasteful business of war. And I have to tell you these things even if you do not believe them, because they are vital to my story. There was not a man alive who could have told you of any real permanent benefit, of anything whatever to counterbalance the obvious waste and evil, that would result from a war between England and Germany, whether England shattered Germany or was smashed and overwhelmed, or whatever the end might be. The thing was, in fact, an enormous irrational obsession. It was, in the microcosm of our nation, curiously parallel to the egotistical wrath and jealousy that swayed my individual microcosm. It measured the excess of common emotion over the common intelligence, the legacy of inordinate passion we have received from the brute from which we came. Just as I had become the slave of my own surprise and anger and went hither and thither with a loaded revolver, seeking and intending vague, fluctuating crimes, so these two nations went about the earth, hot-eared and muddle-headed, with loaded navies and armies terribly ready at hand. Only there was not even a Nettie to justify their stupidity. There was nothing but quiet imaginary thwarting on either side, and the press was the chief instrument that kept these two huge multitudes of people directed against one another. The press, those newspapers that are now so strange to us, like the empires, the nations, the trusts, and all the other great monstrous shapes of that extraordinary time, was in the nature of an unanticipated accident. It had happened as weeds happen in abandoned gardens, just as all our world has happened, because there was no clear will in the world to bring about anything better. Towards the end, this press was almost entirely under the direction of youngish men of that eager, rather unintelligent type, that is never able to detect itself aimless, that pursues nothing with incredible pride and zeal. And if you would really understand this mad era the Comet brought to an end, you must keep in mind that every phase in the production of these queer old things was pervaded by a strong, aimless energy and happened in a concentrated rush. Let me describe to you very briefly a newspaper that day. Figure first, then, a hastily erected and still more hastily designed building in a dirty, paper-littered back street of old London, and a number of shabbily dressed men coming and going in with this projectile swiftness, and within this factory companies of printers, tensely active with nimble fingers. They were always speeding up the printers, ply their typesetting machines, and cast and arrange masses of metal in a sort of kitchen inferno, above which, in a beehive of little brightly lit rooms, disheveled men sit and scribble. There is a throbbing of telephones and a clicking of telegraph needles, a rushing of messengers, a running to and fro of heated men, clutching proofs and copy. Then begins a clatter-roar of machinery, catching the infection, going faster and faster, and whizzing and banging. Engineers who have never had time to wash since their birth, flying about with oil cans while paper runs off its rolls with a shudder of haste. The proprietor, you must suppose, arriving explosively in a swift motor car, leaping out before the thing is at a standstill with letters and documents clutched in his hand, rushing in, resolute to hustle, getting wonderfully in everybody's way. At the sight of him, even the messenger boys are waiting, get up and scamper to and fro. Sprinkle your vision with collisions, curses, incoherencies. You imagine all the parts of this complex, lunatic machine working hysterically toward a crescendo of haste and excitement as the night wears on. At last, the only thing that seems to travel slowly in all those tearing, vibrating premises are the hands of the clock. Slowly, things draw on toward publication, the consummation of all those stresses. Then, in the small hours, into the now dark and deserted streets, comes a wide whirl of carts and men. The place spurts about paper at every door, bales, heaps, torrents of paper, that are snatched and flung about in what looks like a free fight, and off with a rush and clatter east, west, north, and south. The interest passes outwardly. The men from the little rooms are going homeward, the printers disperse yawning, the roaring presses slacken, the paper exists. Distribution follows manufacture, and we follow the bundles. Our vision becomes a vision of dispersal. You see those bundles hurtling into stations, catching trains by a hair's breadth, speeding on their way, breaking up, smaller bundles of them hurled with a fierce accuracy out upon the platforms that rush by, and then everywhere a division of these smaller bundles into still smaller bundles, into dispersing parcels, into separate papers, and the dawn happens unnoticed amidst a great running and shouting of boys. A shoving through letter slots, opening of windows, spreading out upon bookstalls. For the space of a few hours you must figure the whole country dotted white with rustling papers, placards everywhere vociferating the hurried lie for the day. Men and women in trains, men and women eating and reading, men by study fenders, people sitting up in bed, Mothers and sons and daughters waiting for father to finish. A million scattered people reading headlong or feverishly ready to read. It is just as if some vehement jet had sprayed that white foam of papers over the surface of the land. And then wonderfully gone utterly, vanished as foam might vanish upon the sand. Nonsense, the whole affair of noisy paroxysm of nonsense, unreasonable excitement, witless mischief, and waste of strength, signifying nothing. And one of those white parcels was the paper I held in my hands as I sat with a bandaged foot on the steel fender in that dark underground kitchen of my mother's, clean roused from my personal troubles by the yelp of the headlines. She sat, sleeves tucked up from her ropey arms, peeling potatoes as I read. It was like one of a flood of disease germs that have invaded a body, that paper. There I was, one corpuscle in the big amorphous body of the English community. One of 40 million such corpuscles, and for all my preoccupations, those potent headlines, this paper ferment, caught me and swung me about. And all over the country that day, millions read as I read, and came round into line with me under the same magnetic spell. Came round, how did we say it? To face the foe. The Comet had been driven into obscurity over leaf. The column-headed, distinguished scientist says Comet will strike our Earth. Does it matter? Went unread. Germany. I usually figured this mythical malignant creature as a corseted, stiff-mustached emperor enhanced by heraldic black wings and a large sword, had insulted our flag. That was the message of the new paper, and the monster towered over me, threatening fresh outrages, visibly spitting upon my faultless country's colors. Somebody hoisted a British flag on the right bank of some tropical river I had never heard of before, and a drunken German officer, under ambiguous instructions, had torn it down. Then one of the convenient, abundant natives of the country, a British subject indisputably, had been shot in the leg. But the facts were by no means clear. Nothing was clear except that we were not going to stand any nonsense from Germany. Whatever had or had not happened, we meant to have an apology for, and apparently they did not mean apologizing. Has war come at last? That was the headline. One's heart leapt to assent. There were hours that day when I clean forgot Nettie, in dreaming of battles and victories by land and sea, of shellfire and entrenchments, and the heaped slaughter of many thousands of men. But the next morning, I started for Checkshill. Started, I remember, in a curiously hopeful state of mind, oblivious of comets, strikes, and wars. Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 5. You must understand that I had no set plan of murder when I walked over to Checkshill. I had no set plan of any sort. There was a great confusion of dramatically conceived intentions in my head, scenes of threatening and denunciation and terror, but I did not mean to kill. The revolver was turned upon my rival, my disadvantage in age and physique. But that was not in really. The revolver. I took the revolver because I had the revolver and was a foolish young lout. It was a dramatic sort of thing to take. I had, I say, no plan at all. Ever and again during that second trudge to Checkshill, I was irradiated with a novel, unreasonable hope. I had awakened in the morning with the hope that it may have been the last unfaded trail of some obliterated dream, that after all Nettie might relent toward me, that her heart was kind toward me in spite of all that I had imagined had happened. I even thought it possible that I might have misinterpreted what I had seen. Perhaps she would explain everything. My revolver was in my pocket for all that. I limped at the outset, but after the second mile my ankle warmed to forgetfulness, and the rest of the way I walked well. Suppose, after all, I was wrong. I was still debating that as I came through the park. By the corner of the paddock near the keeper's cottage, I was reminded by some belated blue hyacinths of a time when I and Nettie had gathered them together. It seemed impossible that we could really have parted ourselves for good and all. A wave of tenderness flowed over me and still flooded me as I came through the little dell and drew towards the hollies. But there the sweet Nettie of my boy's love faded, and I thought of the new Nettie of desire and the man I had come upon in the moonlight. I thought of the narrow, hot purpose that had grown so strongly out of my springtime freshness, and my mood darkened to night. I crossed the beech wood and came towards the gardens with a resolute and sorrowful heart. When I reached the green door in the garden wall, I was seized for a space with so violent a trembling that I could not grip the latch to lift it, for I no longer had any doubt how this would end. That trembling was succeeded by a feeling of cold and whiteness and self-pity. I was astonished to find myself grimacing, to feel my cheeks wet, and thereupon I gave way completely to a wild passion of weeping. I must take just a little time before the thing was done. I turned away from the door and stumbled for a little distance, sobbing loudly, and lay out among the sight of the bracken, and so presently became calm again. I lay there some time. I had half a mind to desist, and then my emotion passed like the shadow of a cloud, and I walked very coolly into the gardens. Through the open door of one of the glass houses I saw old Stuart. He was leaning against the staging, his hands in his pockets, and so deep in thought he gave no heed to me. I hesitated and went on towards the cottage, slowly. Something struck me as unusual about the place, but I could not tell at first what it was. One of the bedroom windows was open, and the customary short blind, with its brass upper rail partly unfastened, drooped obliquely across the vacant space. It looked negligent and odd, for usually everything about the cottage was conspicuously trim. The door was standing wide open, and everything was still. But giving that usual orderly hall an odd look, it was about 2:30 in the afternoon. Was a pile of 3 dirty plates with used knives and forks upon them, on one of the hall chairs. I went into the hall and looked into either room and hesitated. Then I fell to open the door knocker and gave a loud rat-tat-too, and I followed this up with an amiable hello. For a time no one answered, and I stood listening and expectant with my fingers about my weapon. Someone moved about upstairs presently and was still again. The tension of waiting seemed to brace my nerves. I had my hand on the knocker for the second time when Puss appeared in the doorway. For a moment we remained staring at one another without speaking. Her hair was disheveled, her face dirty, tear-stained, and irregularly red. Her expression at the sight of me was pure astonishment. I thought she was about to say something, and then she had darted away out of the house again. "I say, Puss," I said. "Puss!" I followed her out of the door. "Puss, what's the matter? Where's Nettie?" She vanished round the corner of the house. I hesitated, perplexed whether I should pursue her. What did it all mean? Then I heard someone upstairs. "Willie!" cried the voice of Mrs. Stewart. "Is that you?" "Yes," I answered. "Where's everyone? Where's Nettie? I want to have a talk with her." She did not answer, but I heard her dress rustle as she moved. I judged she was upon the landing overhead. I paused at the foot of the stairs, expecting her to appear and come down. Suddenly came a strange sound, a rush of sounds, words jumbled and hurrying, confused and shapeless, borne along upon a note of throaty distress that at last submerged the words altogether and ended in a wail. Except that it came from a woman's throat, it was exactly the babbling sound of a weeping child with a grievance. "I can't," she said, "I can't," and that was all I could distinguish. It was to my young ears the strangest sound conceivable from a kindly, motherly little woman, whom I had always thought of chiefly as an unparalleled maker of cakes. It frightened me. I went upstairs at once in a state of infinite alarm. And there she was upon the landing, leaning forward over the top of the chest of drawers beside her open bedroom door, and weeping. I never saw such weeping. One thick strand of black hair had escaped, and hung with a spiral twist down her back. Never before had I noticed that she had grey hairs. As I came up upon the landing, her voice rose again. "Oh, that I should have to tell you, Willie. Oh, that I should have to tell you." She dropped her head again, and a fresh gust of tears swept all further words away. I said nothing. I was too astonished, but I drew nearer to her and waited. I never saw such weeping. The extraordinary wetness of her dripping handkerchief abides with me to this day. "That I should have lived to see this day," she wailed. "I had rather 1,000 times she was struck dead at my feet." I began to understand. "Mrs. Stewart," I said, clearing my throat, "what has become of Nettie?" "That I should have lived to see this day," she said by way of reply. I waited till her passion abated. There came a lull. I forgot the weapon in my pocket. I said nothing, and suddenly she stood erect before me, wiping her swollen eyes. "Willie," she gulped, "she's gone." "Nettie?" "Gone! Run away from her home. Oh, Willie, the shame of it, the sin and shame of it." She flung herself upon my shoulder and clung to me, and began again to wish her daughter lying dead at our feet. There, there, said I, and all my being was a tremble. Where is she gone? I said as softly as I could. But for the time she was preoccupied with her own sorrow, and I had to hold her there and comfort her with the blackness of finality spreading over my soul. Where has she gone? I asked for the fourth time. I don't know. We don't know. And oh, Willie, she went out yesterday morning. I said to her, Nettie, I said to her, you're mighty fine for a morning call. Fine clothes for a fine day, she said. And that was her last words to me. Willie, the child I suckled at my breast. Yes, yes, but where has she gone? I said. She went on with sobs, and now telling her story with a sort of fragmentary hurry. She went out bright and shining, out of this house forever. She was smiling, Willie, as if she was glad to be going. Glad to be going, I echoed, with soundless lips. You're mighty fine for the morning, I says, mighty fine. Let the girl be pretty, says her father, while she's young. And somewhere she'd got a parcel of her things hidden to pick up, and she was going off, out of this house forever. She became quiet. Let the girl be pretty, she repeated. Let the girl be pretty while she's young. Oh, how can we go on living, Willie? He doesn't show it, but he's like a stricken beast. He's wounded to the heart. She was always his favorite. He never seemed to care for Puss like he did for her, and she's wounded him. Where is she gone? I reverted at last to that. We don't know. She leaves her own blood. She trusts herself. Oh, Willie, it'll kill me. I wish she and me together were lying in our graves. But, I moistened my lips and spoke slowly, she may have gone to marry. If that was so, I've prayed to God it might be so, Willie. I've prayed that he'd take pity on her. I mean, him she's with. I jerked out, Who's that? In her letter, she said he was a gentleman. She did say he was a gentleman. In her letter, has she written? Can I see her letter? Her father took it. But if she writes, when did she write? It came this morning. But where did it come from? You can tell. She didn't say. She said she was happy. She said love took one like a storm. Curse that. Where is her letter? Let me see it. And as for this gentleman, she stared at me. You know who it is. Willie, she protested. You know who it is, whether she said or not. Her eyes made a mute, unconfident denial. Young Verrall? She made no answer. All I could do for you, Willie, she began presently. Was it young Verrall? I insisted. For a second, perhaps, we faced one another in stark understanding. Then she plumped back to the chest of drawers and her wet pocket handkerchief, and I knew she sought refuge from my relentless eyes. My pity for her vanished. She knew it was her mistress's son as well as I. And for some time she had known, she had felt. I hovered over her for a moment, sick with amazed disgust. I suddenly bethought me of old Stewart out in the greenhouse, and turned out and went downstairs. As I did so, I looked up to see Miss Stewart moving, droopily and lamely, back into her own room. Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 6. Old Stewart was pitiful. I found him still inert in the greenhouse where I had first seen him. He did not move as I drew near him. He glanced at me and then stared hard again at the flower pots before him. Willie, he said, this is a black day for all of us. What are you going to do? I asked. The missus takes on so, he said. I came out here. What do you mean to do? What is a man to do in such a case? Do, I cried. Why, do. He ought to marry her, he said. By God, yes, I cried. He must do that anyhow. He ought to. It's cruel. But what am I to do? Suppose he won't. Likely he won't. What then? He drooped with an intensified despair. Here's this cottage, he said, pursuing some contracted argument. We've lived here all our lives, you might say. Clear out, at my age, one can't die in a slum. I stood before him for a space, speculating what thoughts might fill the gaps between these broken words. I found his lethargy and dimly shaped mental attitudes his words indicated abominable. I said abruptly, You have her letter? He dived into his breast pocket, became motionless for 10 seconds, then woke up again and produced her letter. He drew it clumsily from its envelope and handed it to me silently. Why, he cried, looking at me for the first time, what's come to your chin, Willie? It's nothing, I said. It's a bruise. And I opened the letter. It was written on greenish-tinted fancy notepaper, and with all and more than Nettie's usual triteness and inadequacy of expression, her handwriting bore no traces of emotion. It was round and upright, and clear as though it had been done in a writing lesson. Always her letters were like masks upon her image. They fell like curtains before the changing charm of her face. One altogether forgot the sound of her light clear voice, confronted by a perplexing stereotyped thing that had mysteriously got hold upon one's heart and pride. How did that letter run? My dear mother, do not be distressed at my going away. I have gone somewhere safe, and with someone who cares for me very much. I am sorry for your sakes, but it seems that it had to be. Love is a very difficult thing, and takes hold of one in ways one does not expect. Do not think I am ashamed about this. I glory in my love, and you must not trouble too much about me. I am very, very happy, deeply underlined. Fondest love to father and puss. Your loving Nettie. That queer little document, I could see it now for the childish simple thing it was, but at the time I read it in a suppressed anguish of rage. It plunged me into a pit of hopeless shame. There seemed to remain no pride for me in life until I had revenge. I stood staring at those rounded upstanding letters, not trusting myself to speak or move. At last I stole a glance at Stuart. He held the envelope in his hand and stared down at the postmark between his horny thumbnails. You can't even tell where she is, he said, turning the thing round in a hopeless manner and then desisting. It's hard on us, Willie. Here she is. She hadn't anything to complain of. A sort of pet for all of us. Not even made to do her share of the housework. And then she goes off and leaves us like a bird that's learnt to fly. Can't trust us. That's what takes me. Puts herself, but there. What's to happen to her? What's to happen to him? He shook his head to show that problem was beyond him. You'll go after her, I said in an even voice. You'll make him marry her? Where am I to go? He asked helplessly, and held out the envelope with a gesture. And what could I do? Even if I knew, how could I leave the gardens? Great God, I cried. Not leave these gardens. It's your honor, man. If she was my daughter, I'd tear the world to pieces. I choked. You mean to stand it? What can I do? Make him marry her. Horsewhip him, I'd say. I'd strangle him. He scratched slowly at his hairy cheek, opened his mouth and shook his head. Then, with an intolerable note of sluggish gentle wisdom, he said, People of our sort, Willie, can't do things like that. I came near to raving. I had a wild impulse to strike him in the face. Once in my boyhood, I happened upon a bird terribly mangled by some cat and killed it in a frenzy of horror and pity. I had a gust of that same emotion now, as this shameful, mutilated soul fluttered in the dust before me. Then, I dismissed him from the case. May I look? I asked. He held out the envelope reluctantly. There it is, he said, and pointing with his garden rough forefinger, IAPAMP. What can you make of that? I took the thing in my hands. The adhesive stamp customary in those days was defaced by a circular postmark, which bore the name of the office of departure and the date. The impact in this particular case had been light or made without sufficient ink, and half the letters of the name had left no impression. I could distinguish IAPAMP, and very faintly below DSO. I guessed the name in an instant flash of intuition. It was Champenberry. The very gaps shaped to my mind. Perhaps in a sort of semi-visibility other letters were there, at least hinting themselves. It was a place somewhere on the east coast, I knew, either in Norfolk or Suffolk. Why, cried I, and stopped. And what was the good of telling him? Old Stuart had glanced up sharply, I am inclined to think almost fearfully, into my face. You haven't got it? He said. Champenberry, I should remember that. You don't think you got it? He said. I handed the envelope back to him. For a moment, I thought it might be Hampton, I said. Hampton, he repeated. Hampton. How could you make Hampton? He turned the envelope about. Ham. Why, Willie, you're a worse hand at the job than me. He placed the letter in the envelope and stood erect to put this back in his breast pocket. I did not mean to take any risks in this affair. I drew a stump of pencil from my waistcoat pocket, turned a little away from him, and wrote Champenberry very quickly on my frayed and rather grimy shirt cuff. Well, said I, with an air of having done nothing remarkable. I turned to him with some unimportant observation, I have forgotten what. I never finished whatever vague remark I commenced. I looked up to see a third person waiting at the greenhouse door. Book 1, Chapter 3, Section 7. It was old Mrs. Verrall. I wonder if I can convey the effect of her to you. She was a little old lady with extraordinarily flaxen hair. Her weak, aquiline features were pursed up into an assumption of dignity, and she was richly dressed. I would like to underline that richly dressed, or have the words printed in florid Old English or Gothic lettering. No one on earth is now quite so richly dressed as she was. No one old or young indulges in so quiet and yet so profound a sumptuosity. But you must not imagine any extravagance of outline or any beauty of richness of color. The predominant colors were black and fur browns, and the effects of richness was due entirely to the extreme costliness of the materials employed. She affected silk brocades with rich and elaborate patterns, priceless black lace over creamy or purple satin, intricate trimmings through which threads and bands of velvet wriggled, and in the winter rare furs. Her gloves fitted exquisitely, and ostentatiously simple chains of fine gold and pearls, and a great number of bracelets laced about her little person. One was forced to feel that the slightest article she wore cost more than all the wardrobe of a dozen girls like Nettie. Her bonnet affected the simplicity that is beyond rubies, richness that is the first quality about this lady that I would like to convey to you, and the second was cleanliness. You felt that old Mrs. Verrall was exquisitely clean. If you had boiled my poor dear old mother in soda for a month, you wouldn't have gotten her so clean as Mrs. Verrall constantly and manifestly was. And pervading all her presence shone her third great quality, her manifest confidence in the respectful subordination of the world. She was pale and a little out of breath that day, but without any loss of her ultimate confidence. And it was clear to me that she had come to interview Stuart upon the outbreak of passion that had bridged the gulf between their families. And here again I find myself writing in an unknown language, so far as my young readers are concerned. You who know only the world that followed the great change will find much that I am telling inconceivable. Upon these points I cannot appeal, as I have appealed for other confirmations, to the old newspapers. These were the things that no one wrote about because everyone understood and everyone had taken up an attitude. There were in England and America, and indeed throughout the world, two great informal divisions of human beings, the secure and the insecure. There was not and never had been in either country a nobility. It was and remains a common error that the British peers were noble. Neither in law nor custom were there noble families, and we altogether lacked the edification one found in Russia, for example, of a poor nobility. A peerage was a hereditary possession that, like the family land, concerned only the eldest sons of the house. It radiated no luster of noblesse oblige. The rest of the world were in law and practice common, and all America was common. But through the private ownership of lands that had resulted from the neglect of feudal obligations in Britain and the utter want of political foresight in the Americas, large masses of property had become artificially stable in the hands of a small minority, to whom it was necessary to mortgage all new public and private enterprises, and who were held together not by any tradition of service and nobility, but by the natural sympathy of common interests and a common large scale of living. It was a class without any very definitive boundaries. Vigorous individualities, by methods for the most part violent and questionable, were constantly thrusting themselves from insecurity to security. And the sons and daughters of secure people, by marrying insecurity, or by wild extravagance or flagrant vice, would sink into the life of anxiety and insufficiency, which was the ordinary life of man. The rest of the population was landless and, except by working directly or indirectly for the secure, had no legal right to exist. And such was the shallowness and insufficiency of our thought, such was the stifled egotism of all our feelings before the last days, that very few indeed of the secure could be found to doubt that this was the natural and only conceivable order of the world. It is the life of the insecure under the old order that I am displaying, and I hope that I am conveying something of its hopeless bitterness to you. But you must not imagine that the secure lived lives of paradisical happiness. The pit of insecurity below them made itself felt, even though it was not comprehended. Life about them was ugly, the sight of ugly and mean houses, of ill-dressed people, the vulgar appeals of the dealers in popular commodities were not to be escaped. There was below the threshold of their minds an uneasiness. They not only did not think clearly about social economy, but they displayed an instinctive disinclination to think. Their security was not so perfect that they had not a dread of falling towards the pit. They were always lashing themselves by new ropes, their cultivation of connections, of interests, their desire to confirm and improve their positions was a constant and noble preoccupation. You must read Thackeray to get the full flavor of their lives. Then the bacterium was apt to disregard class distinctions, and they were never really happy in their servants. Read their surviving books. Each generation bewails the decay of that fidelity of servants no generation ever saw. A world that is squalid in one corner is squalid altogether, but they never understood. They believed there was not enough of any to go around. They believed that this was the intention of God and an incurable condition of life, and they held passionately and with a sense of right to their disproportionate share. They maintained a common intercourse as society of all who were practically secure, and their choice of that word is exhaustively eloquent of the quality of their philosophy. But if you can master these alien ideas upon which the old system rested, just in the same measure, you will understand the horror these people had for marriages for the insecure. In the case of their girls and women, it was extraordinarily rare, and in the case of either sex, it was regarded as a disastrous social crime. Anything was better than that. You are probably aware of the hideous fate that was only too probably the lot, during those last dark days, of every girl of the insecure classes who loved and gave way to the impulse of self-abandonment without marriage. And so you will understand the peculiar situation of Nettie with young Verrall. One or other had to suffer, and as they were both in a state of great emotional exaltation and capable of strange generosities towards each other, it was an open question and naturally a source of great anxiety to a mother in Miss Verrall's position, whenever the sufferer might not be her son. Whether as the outcome of that glowing, irresponsible commerce Nettie might not return prospective mistress of Checkshill Towers. The chances were greatly against that conclusion, but such things did occur. These laws and customs sound, I know, like a record of some nasty-minded lunatic's inventions. They were invincible facts in that vanished world into which, by some accident, I had been born, and it was the dream of any better state of things that was scouted as lunacy. But just think of it. This girl I loved with all my soul, for whom I was ready to sacrifice my life, was not good enough to marry young Verrall. And I had only to look at this even, handsome, characterless face to perceive a creature weaker and no better than myself. She was to be his pleasure, until he chose to cast her aside, and the poison of our social system had so saturated her nature. His evening dress, his freedom, and his money had seemed so fine to her, and I so clothed in squalor, that to that prospect she had consented. And to resent the social conventions that created their situation was called class envy. And gently born preachers reproached us for the mildest resentment against an injustice no living man would now either endure or consent to profit by. What was the sense of saying peace when there was no peace? If there was one hope in the disorders of that old world, it lay in revolt and conflict to the death. But if you can really grasp the shameful grotesqueness of the old life, you will begin to appreciate the interpretation of old Mrs. Verrall's appearance that leapt up at once in my mind. She had come to compromise the disaster, and the Stuarts would compromise. I saw that only too well. An enormous disgust at the prospect of an imminent encounter between Stuart and his mistress made me behave in a violent and irrational way. I wanted to escape seeing even Stuart's first gesture in that at any cost. "I'm off," said I, and turned my back on him without any further farewell. My line of retreat lay by the old lady, and so I advanced toward her. I saw her expression change. Her mouth fell a little way open, her forehead wrinkled, and her eyes grew round. She found me a queer customer, even at the first sight, and there was something in the manner of my advance that took away her breath. She stood at the top of 3 or 4 steps that descended to the level of the hothouse floor. She receded a pace or two, with a certain offended dignity at the determination of my rush. I gave her no sort of salutation. Well, as a matter of fact, I did give her a sort of salutation. There is no occasion for me to begin apologizing now for the thing I said to her. I stripped these things before you. If only I can get them stark enough, you will understand and forgive. I was filled with a brutal and overpowering desire to insult her. And so I addressed this poor, little expensive old woman in the following terms, converting her by a violent metonymy into my comprehensive plural. You infernal land thieves, I said point blank into her face. Have you come to offer them money? And without waiting to test her powers of repartee, I passed rudely beyond her and vanished, striding with my fists clenched out of her world again. I have tried since to imagine how the thing must have looked to her. So far as her particular universe went, I had not existed at all. Or I had existed only as a dim black thing, an insignificant speck, far away across her park in irrelevant, unimportant transit, until this moment when she came, sedately troubled, into her own secure gardens, and sought for Stuart among the greenhouses. Then, abruptly, I flashed into being down that green-walled, brick-floored vista as a black-avised, ill-clad young man, who first stared and then advanced scowling toward her. Once in existence, I developed rapidly. I grew larger in perspective and became more and more important and sinister every moment. I came up the steps with inconceivable hostility and disrespect in my bearing, towered over her, becoming for an instant at least a sort of second French Revolution, and discovered myself with the intensest concentration of those wicked and incomprehensible words. Just for a second I threatened annihilation. Happily, that was my climax. And then I had gone by, and the universe was very much as it had always been, except for the wild swirl within it, and the faint sense of insecurity my episode left in its wake. The thing that never entered my head in those days was that a large proportion of the rich were rich in absolute good faith. I thought they saw things exactly as I saw them, and wickedly denied. But indeed, old Mrs. Verrall was no more capable of doubting the perfection of her family's right to dominate a wide countryside than she was of examining the 39 Articles, or dealing with any other sort of adamantine pillars upon which her universe rested in security. No doubt I startled and frightened her tremendously, but she could not understand. None of her sort of people ever did seem to understand such livid flashes of hate as ever and again lit the crowded darkness below their feet. The thing leaped out of the black for a moment and vanished, like a threatening figure by a desolate roadside lit for a moment by one's belated carriage lamp, and then swallowed up by the night. They counted it with nightmares and did their best to forget what was evidently as insignificant as it was disturbing. Book 1, Chapter 4, War, Section 1. From that moment when I insulted old Mrs. Verrall, I became representative. I was a man who stood for all the disinherited of the world. I had no hope of pride or pleasure left in me. I was raging rebellion against God and mankind. There were no more vague intentions swaying me this way and that. I was perfectly clear now upon what I meant to do. I would make my protest and die. I would make my protest and die. I was going to kill Nettie, who had smiled and promised and given herself to another, and who stood now for all the conceivable delightfulness, the lost imaginations of the youthful heart, the unattainable joys in life. And Verrall, who stood for all who profited by the incurable injustice of our social order. I would kill them both, and that being done, I would blow my brains out and see what vengeance followed my blank refusal to live. So indeed I was resolved. I raged monstrously, and above me, abolishing the stars, triumphant over the yellow waning moon that followed it below, the giant meteor towered up towards the zenith. "Let me only kill," I cried. "Let me only kill." So I shouted in my frenzy. I was in a fever that defied hunger and fatigue. For a long time, I had prowled over the heath towards Lowchester, talking to myself. And now that night had finally come, I was tramping homeward, walking the long 17 miles without a thought of rest, and I had eaten nothing since the morning. I suppose I must count myself mad, but I can recall my ravings. There were times when I walked weeping through that brightness that was neither night nor day. There were times when I reasoned in a topsy-turvy fashion with what I called the spirit of all things. But I always spoke to that white glory in the sky. Why am I here, only to suffer ignominies? I asked. Why have you made me with pride that cannot be satisfied, with desires that turn and rend me? Is it a jest, this world, a joke you play on your guests? I, even I, have a better humor than that. Why not learn from me a certain decency of mercy? Why not undo? Have I ever tormented, day by day, some wretched worm, making filth for it to trail through? Filth that disgusts it, starving it, bruising it, mocking it? Why should you? Your jokes are clumsy. Try some milder fun up there, do you hear? Something that doesn't hurt so infernally? You say this is your purpose with me. You are making something with me, birth pangs of a soul. Ah, how can I believe you? You forget I have eyes for other things. Let my own case go. But what of frog beneath the cartwheel, God, and the bird the cat had torn? And after such blasphemies, I would fling out a ridiculous little debating society hand. Answer me that. A week ago, it had been moonlight, white and black and hard across the spaces of the park, but now the light was livid and full of the quality of haze. An extraordinarily low white mist, not 3 feet above the ground, drifted broodingly across the grass, and the trees rose ghostly out of that phantom sea. Great and shadowy and strange was the world that night. No one seemed abroad. I and my little cracked voice drifted solitary through the silent mysteries. Sometimes I argued, as I have told. Sometimes I tumbled along in moody vacuity. Sometimes my torment was vivid and acute. Abruptly, out of apathy, would come a boiling paroxysm of fury, when I thought of Nettie mocking me and laughing, and of her and Varall clasped in one another's arms. I will not have it so, I screamed. I will not have it so. And in one of these raving fits, I drew my revolver from my pocket and fired into the quiet night. 3 times I fired it. The bullets tore through the air. The startled trees told one another in diminishing echoes the thing I had done. And then, with a slow finality, the vast impatient night healed again to calm. My shots, my curses and blasphemies, my prayers, for anon I prayed that silence took them all. It was, how can I express it, a stifled outcry tranquilized, lost, amid the serene assumptions, the overwhelming empire of that brightness. The noise of my shots, the impact upon things, had for the instant been enormous, then it passed away. I found myself standing with the revolver held up, astonished, my emotions penetrated by something I could not understand. Then I looked over my shoulder at the great star and remained staring at it. "Who are you?" I said at last. I was like a man in a solitary desert who had suddenly heard a voice. That too passed. As I came over Clayton Crest, I recalled that I missed the multitude that now night after night walked out to stare at the comet, and the little preacher in the waste beyond the hoardings who warned sinners to repent before the judgment was not in his usual place. It was long past midnight and everyone had gone home, but I did not think of this at first, and the solitude perplexed me and left the memory behind. The gas lamps were all extinguished because of the brightness of the comet, and that too was unfamiliar. The little newsagent in the still high street had shut up and gone to bed, but one belated board had been put out late and forgotten, and it still bore its placard. The word upon it, there was but one word upon it in staring letters, was war. You figure that empty mean street, emptily echoing to my footsteps, no soul awake and audible but me. Then my halt at the placard, and amidst that sleeping stillness, smeared hastily upon the board, a little askew and crumpled, but quite distinct beneath that cool meteoric glare, preposterous and appalling, the measureless evil of that word, war. Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 2. I awoke in that state of equanimity that so often follows an emotional drenching. It was late, and my mother was beside my bed. She had some breakfast for me on a battered tray. "Don't get up yet, dear," she said. "You've been sleeping. It was 3 o'clock when you got home last night. You must have been tired out." "Your poor face," she went on, "was as white as a sheet and your eyes shining. It frightened me to let you in, and you stumbled on the stairs." My eyes went quietly to my coat pocket where something still bulged. She probably had not noticed. "I went to Chexhill," I said. "You know, perhaps?" "I got a letter last evening, dear." And as she bent near me to put the tray upon my knees, she kissed my hair softly. For a moment we both remained still, resting on that, her cheek just touching my head. I took the tray from her to end the pause. "Don't touch my clothes, Mummy," I said sharply as she moved towards them. "I'm still equal to a clothes brush." And then, as she turned away, I astonished her by saying, "You dear mother, you. A little, I understand. Only now, dear mother, oh, let me be, let me be." And with the docility of a good servant, she went from me, dear heart of submission that the world and I had used so ill. It seemed to me that morning that I could never give way to a gust of passion again. A sorrowful firmness of the mind possessed me. My purpose seemed now as inflexible as iron. There was neither love, nor hate, nor fear left in me. Only I pitied my mother greatly for all that was still to come. I ate my breakfast slowly, and thought where I could find out about Champenberry, and how I might hope to get there. I had not 5 shillings in the world. I dressed methodically, choosing the least frayed of my collars, and shaving much more carefully than was my wont. Then I went down to the public library to consult a map. Champenberry was on the east coast of Essex, a long and complicated journey from Clayton. I went to the railway station and made some memoranda from the timetables. The porters, I asked, were not very clear about Champenberry, but the booking office clerk was helpful, and we puzzled out all I wanted to know. Then I came out into the coaly street again. At least I ought to have £2. I went back to the public library and into the newspaper room to think over this problem. A fact intruded itself upon me. People seemed in an altogether exceptional stir about the morning journals. There was something unusual in the air of the room, more people and more talking than usual, and for a moment I was puzzled. Then I bethought me. This war with Germany, of course. A naval battle was supposed to be in progress in the North Sea. Let them. I returned to the consideration of my own affairs. Parload? Could I go and make it up with him and then borrow? I weighed the chances of that. Then I thought of selling or pawning something, but that seemed difficult. My winter overcoat had not cost £1 when it was new. My watch was not likely to fetch many shillings. Still, both these things might be factors. I thought with a certain repugnance of the little store my mother was probably making for the rent. She was very secretive about that, and it was locked in an old tea caddy in her bedroom. I knew it would be almost impossible to get any of that money from her willingly, and though I told myself that in this issue of passion and death no detail mattered, I could not get rid of tormenting scruples whenever I thought of that tea caddy. Was there no other course? Perhaps every other source had been tapped. I might supplement with a few shillings frankly begged from her. These others, I said to myself, thinking without passion for once of the sons of the secure, would find it difficult to run their romances on a pawnshop basis. However, we must manage it. I felt the day was passing on, but I did not get excited about that. Slow is swiftest, Parload used to say, and I meant to get everything thought out completely, to take a long aim, and then to act as a bullet flies. I hesitated at a pawnshop on my way home to my midday meal, but I determined not to pledge my watch until I could bring my overcoat also. I ate silently, revolving plans. Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 3. After our midday dinner, it was a potato pie, mostly potato, with some scraps of cabbage and bacon. I put on my overcoat and got it out of the house while my mother was in the scullery at the back. A scullery in the old world was, in the case of such houses as ours, a damp, unsavory, mainly subterranean region behind the dark living-room kitchen that was rendered more than typically dirty in our case by the fact that into the coal cellar, a yawning pit of black uncleanness opened and diffused small crunchable particles about the uneven brick floor. It was the region of washing up, that greasy, damp function that followed every meal. Its atmosphere had ever a cooling steaminess and the memory of boiled cabbage, and the sooty black stains where saucepan or kettle had been put down for a minute, scraps of potato peel caught by the strainer of the escape pipe, and rags of a quite indescribable horribleness of acquisition called dishclouts rise in my memory of the name. The altar of this place was the sink, a tank of stone, revolting to a refined touch, grease-filmed and unpleasant to see. And above this was a tap for cold water, so arranged that when the water descended, it splashed and wetted whoever had turned it on. This tap was our water supply, and in such a place you must fancy a little old woman, rather incompetent and very gentle, a soul of unselfishness and sacrifice, in dirty clothes, all come from their original colors to a common dusty dark gray, and worn ill-fitting boots, with hands distorted by ill use, and tidy graying hair, my mother. In the winter her hands would be chapped, and she would have a cough, and while she washes up I go out, to sell my overcoat and watch in order that I may desert her. I gave way to queer hesitations in pawning my 2 negotiable articles. A weekly indisposition to pawn in Clayton, where the pawnbroker knew me, carried me to the door of the place in Lynch Street, Swathing Leah, where I had bought my revolver. Then came an idea that I was giving too many facts about myself to one man, and I came back to Clayton after all. I forgot how much money I got, but I remember that it was rather less than the sum I had made out to be the single fare to Champenberry. Still deliberate, I went back to the public library. I found out whether it was possible by walking for 10 or 12 miles anywhere to shorten the journey. My boots were in a dreadful state. The sole of the left one was now also peeling off, and I could not help perceiving that all my plans might be wrecked if at this crisis I went on shoe leather, in which I could only shuffle. So long as I went softly they would serve, but not for hard walking. I went to the shoemaker in Hacker Street, but he would not promise any repairs for me under 48 hours. I got back home about 5 minutes to 3, resolved to start by the 5 train for Birmingham in any case, but still dissatisfied about my money. I thought of pawning a book or something of that sort, but I could think of nothing of obvious value in the house. My mother's silver, 2 gravy spoons, and a salt cellar had been pawned for some weeks since, in fact, the June quarter day. But my mind was full of hypothetical opportunities. As I came up the steps to our door, I remarked that Mr. Gabitas looked at me suddenly round his dull red curtains with a sort of alarmed resolution in his eye and vanished. And as I walked along the passage, he opened his door upon me suddenly and intercepted me. You are figuring me, I hope, as a dark and sullen lout in shabby, cheap, old-world clothes that are shiny at all the wearing surfaces, and with a discolored red tie and frayed linen. My left hand keeps in my pocket, as though there is something it prefers to keep a grip upon there. Mr. Gabitas was shorter than I, and the first note he struck and the impression he made upon anyone was of something bright and bird-like. I think he wanted to be bird-like. He possessed the possibility of an avian charm, but as a matter of fact there was nothing of the glowing vitality of the bird in his being. And a bird is never out of breath and with an open mouth. He was in the clerical dress at that time, that costume that seems now almost the strangest of all our old-world clothing, and he presented it in its cheapest form, black of a poor texture, ill-fitting, strangely cut. Its long skirts accentuated the tubbiness of his body, the shortness of his legs. The white tie below his all-round collar beneath his innocent, large spectacled face was a little grubby, and between his not very clean teeth he held a briar pipe. His complexion was whitish, and although he was only 33 or 4 perhaps, his sandy hair was already thinning from the top of his head. To your eye now he would seem the strangest figure, in the utter disregard of all physical beauty or dignity about him. You would find him extraordinarily odd, but in the old days he met not only with acceptance but respect. He was alive until within a year or so ago, but his later appearance changed. As I saw him that afternoon, he was very slovenly, ungainly little human being indeed. Not only was his clothing altogether ugly and queer, but had you stripped the man stark, you would certainly have seen in the bulging paunch that comes from flabby muscles and flabbily controlled appetites, and in the rounded shoulders and flawed and yellowish skin, the same failure of any effort toward clean beauty. You had an instinctive sense that so he had been from the beginning. You felt he was not only drifting through life, eating what came in his way, believing what came in his way, doing without any vigor what came in his way, but that into life also he had drifted. You could not believe him the child of pride and high resolve, or of any splendid passion of love. He had just happened. But we all happened then. Why, then, am I taking this tone over this poor little curate in particular? "Hello," he said, with an assumption of friendly ease. "Haven't seen you for weeks. Come in and have a gossip." An invitation from the drawing-room lodger was in the nature of a command. I would have very liked greatly to have refused it. Never was invitation more inopportune, but I had not the wit to think of an excuse. "All right," I said awkwardly, and he held the door open for me. "I'd be very glad if you would," he amplified. "One doesn't get much opportunity of intelligent talk in this parish." What the devil was he up to, was my secret preoccupation. He fussed about me with a nervous hospitality, talking in jumpy fragments, rubbing his hands together, and taking peeps at me over and round his glasses. As I sat down in his leather-covered armchair, I had an odd memory of the one in the Clayton dentist's operating room. I know not why. "They're going to give us trouble in the North Sea, it seems," he remarked with a sort of innocent zest. "I'm glad they mean fighting." There was an air of culture about his room that always cowed me, and that made me constrained even on this occasion. The table under the window was littered with photographic material and the later albums of his continental souvenirs, and on the American cloth-trimmed shelves that filled the recesses on either side of the fireplace were what I used to think in those days a quite incredible number of books, perhaps 800 altogether, including the Reverend Gentleman's photograph albums and college and school textbooks. This suggestion of learning was enforced by the little wooden shield bearing a college coat of arms that hung over the looking-glass, and by a photograph of Mr. Gabitas in cap and gown in an Oxford frame that adorned the opposite wall. And in the middle of that wall stood his writing desk, which I knew to have pigeonholes when it was open, and which made him seem not merely cultured but literary. At that he wrote sermons, composing them himself. "Yes," he said, taking possession of the hearthrug. "The war, to come sooner or later. If we smash their fleet for them now, well, there's an end to the matter." He stood on his toes and then bumped down on his heels and looked blandly through his spectacles at a watercolor by his sister. The subject was a bunch of violets, above the sideboard, which was his pantry and tea chest and cellar. "Yes," he said as he did so. I coughed and wondered how I might presently get away. He invited me to smoke, that queer old practice, and then when I declined, began talking in a confidential tone of this dreadful business of the strikes. That war won't improve that outlook, he said, and was very grave for a moment. He spoke of the want of thought for their wives and children shown by the collieries in striking merely for the sake of the Union, and this stirred me to controversy and distracted me a little from my resolution to escape. "I don't quite agree with that," I said, clearing my throat. "If the men didn't strike for the Union now, if they let that be broken up, where would they be when the pinch of reductions did come?" To which he replied that they couldn't expect to get top-price wages when the masters were selling bottom-price coal. I replied, "That isn't it. The masters don't treat them fairly. They have to protect themselves." To which Mr. Gabitas answered, "Well, I don't know. I've been in the Four Towns some time, and I must say I don't think the balance of injustice falls on the master's side." "It falls on the men," I agreed, willfully misunderstanding him. And so we worked our way toward an argument. Confound this argument, I thought, but I had no skill in self-extraction, and my irritation crept into my voice. 3 little spots of color came into the cheeks and nose of Mr. Gabitas, but his voice showed nothing of his ruffled temper. "You see," I said, "I'm a socialist. I don't think this world was made for a small minority to dance on the faces of everyone else." "My dear fellow," said the Reverend Gabitas, "I'm a socialist too. Who isn't? But that doesn't lead me to class hatred." "You haven't felt the heel of this confounded system. I have." "Ah," said he, and catching him on that note came a rap at the front door, and as he hung suspended the sound of my mother letting someone in and a timid rap. "Now," I thought, and stood up resolutely. But he would not let me. No, he said, "it's only for the Dorcas money." He put his hand against my chest with an effect of physical compulsion and cried, "Come in." "Our talk's just getting interesting," he protested, and there entered Miss Ramel, an elderly little young lady who was mighty in church, helping Clayton. He greeted her. She took no notice of me and went to his bureau, and I remained standing by my chair, but unable to get out of the room. "I'm not interrupting?" asked Mr. Ramel. "Not in the least," he said, drew out the carriers and opened his desk. I could not help seeing what he did. I was so fretted by my impotence to leave him at that moment, it did not connect at all with the research of the morning that he was taking out money. I listened sullenly to his talk with Miss Ramel, and saw only, as they say in Wales, with the front of my eyes, the small flat drawer that had, it seemed, quite a number of sovereigns scattered over its floor. "They're so unreasonable," complained Miss Ramel. "Who could be otherwise in a social organization that bordered on insanity?" I turned away from them, put my foot on the fender, stuck my elbow in the plush-fringed mantelboard, and studied the photographs, pipes, and ashtrays that adorned it. What was it I had to think out before I went to the station? Of course! My mind made a queer little reluctant leap. It felt like being forced to leap over a bottomless chasm, and alighted upon the sovereigns that were just disappearing again as Mr. Gabitas shut his drawer. "I won't interrupt your talk further," said Miss Ramel, receding doorward. Mr. Gabitas played round her politely and opened the door for her and conducted her into the passage, and for a moment or so I had the fullest sense of proximity to those. It seemed to me there must be 10 or 12 sovereigns. The door closed and he returned. My chance of escape had gone. Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 4. "I must be going," I said, with a curiously reinforced desire to get away out of that room. "My dear chap," he insisted, "I can't think of it. Surely there's nothing to call you away?" Then, with an evident desire to shift the venue of our talk, he asked, "You never told me what you thought of Berber's little book." I was now, beneath my dull display of submission, furiously angry with him. It occurred to me to ask myself why I should defer and qualify my opinions to him. Why should I pretend a feeling of intellectual and social inferiority toward him? He asked what I thought of Burble. I resolved to tell him, if necessary with arrogance. Then perhaps he would release me. I did not sit down again, but stood by the corner of the fireplace. "That was the little book you lent me last summer?" I said. "He reasons closely, eh?" he said, and indicated the armchair with a flat hand and beamed persuasively. I remained standing. "I didn't think much of his reasoning powers," I said. "He was one of the cleverest bishops London ever had." "That may be, but he was dodging about in a jolly feeble case," said I. "You mean?" "That he's wrong. I don't think he proves his case. I don't think Christianity is true. He knows himself for the pretender he is. His reasoning's rot." Mr. Gabitas went, I think, a shade paler than his wont, and propitiation vanished from his manner. His eyes and mouth were round, his face seemed to get round, his eyebrows curved at my remarks. "I'm sorry you think that," he said at last, with a catch in his breath. He did not repeat his suggestion that I should sit. He made a step or two toward the window and turned. "I suppose you will admit," he began, with a faintly irritating note of intellectual condescension. "I will not tell you of his arguments or mine. You will find, if you care to look for them, in the out-of-the-way corners of our book museums, the shriveled cheap publications, the publications of the Rationalist Press Association, for example, on which my arguments were based. Lying in that curious limbo with them, mixed up with them and indistinguishable, are the endless replies of orthodoxy, like the mixed dead in some hard-fought trench, all those disputes of our fathers, and they were sometimes furious disputes, have gone now beyond the range of comprehension. You younger people, I know, read them with impatient perplexity. You cannot understand how sane creatures could imagine they had joined issue at all in most of these controversies. All the old methods of systematic thinking, the queer absurdities of the Aristotelian logic, have followed magic numbers and mystical numbers, and the Rumpelstiltskin magic of names now into the blackness of the unthinkable. You can no more understand our theological passions than you can understand the fancies that made all ancient peoples speak to their gods only by circumlocutions, that made savages pine away and die because they had been photographed, or an Elizabethan farmer turn back from a day's expedition because he had met 3 crows. Even I, who have been through it all, recall our controversies now with something near incredulity. Faith we can understand today. All men live by faith, but in the old time everyone confused quite hopelessly faith and a forced, incredible belief in certain pseudo-concrete statements. I am inclined to say that neither believers nor unbelievers had faith as we understand it. They had insufficient intellectual power. They could not trust unless they had something to see and touch and say, like their barbarous ancestors who could not make a bargain without exchange of tokens. If they no longer worshipped stocks and stones, or eked out their needs with pilgrimages and images, they still held fiercely to audible images, to printed words and formula. But why revive the echoes of the ancient logomakis? Suffice it that we lost our tempers very readily in pursuit of God and truth, and said exquisitely foolish things on either side. And on the whole, from the impartial perspective of my 73 years, I adjudicate that if my dialectic was bad, that of the Reverend Gabitas was altogether worse. Little pink spots came into his cheeks, a squealing note into his voice. We interrupted each other more and more rudely. We invented facts and appealed to authorities whose names I mispronounced. And finding Gabitas shy of the higher criticism and the Germans, I used the name of Karl Marx and Engels as Bible exegetes with no little effect. A silly wrangle, a preposterous wrangle. You must imagine our talk becoming louder, with a developing quarrelsome note. My mother, no doubt, hovering on the staircase and listening in alarm, as who should say, "My dear, don't offend it. Oh, don't offend it. Mr. Gabitas enjoys its friendship. Try to think whatever Mr. Gabitas says." Though we still kept in touch with a pretense of mutual deference. The ethical superiority of Christianity to all other religions came to the fore, I know not how. We dealt with the matter in bold, imaginative generalizations because of the insufficiency of our historical knowledge. I was moved to denounce Christianity as the ethic of slaves, and declare myself a disciple of a German writer of no little vogue in those days named Nietzsche. For a disciple, I must confess I was particularly ill acquainted with the works of the master. Indeed, all I knew of him had come to me through a 2-column article in the Clarion for the previous week. But the Reverend Gabitas did not read the Clarion. I am, I know, putting a strain on your credulity when I tell you that I now have little doubt that the Reverend Gabitas was absolutely ignorant even of the name of Nietzsche. Although that writer presented a separate and distinct attitude of attack upon the faith that was in the reverend gentleman's keeping. "I'm a disciple of Nietzsche," said I, with an air of extensive explanation. He shied away so awkwardly at the name that I repeated it at once. "But do you know what Nietzsche says?" I pressed him viciously. "He has certainly been adequately answered," said he, still trying to carry it off. "Who by?" I rapped out hotly. "Tell me that," and became mercilessly expectant. Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 5. A happy accident relieved Mr. Gabitas from the embarrassment of that challenge, and carried me another step along my course of personal disaster. It came on the heels of my question in the form of a clatter of horses without, and the gride and cessation of wheels. I glimpsed a straw-hatted coachman and a pair of greys. It seemed an incredibly magnificent carriage for Clayton. Said the Reverend Gabitas, going to the window. "Why, it's old Mrs. Verrall. It's old Mrs. Verrall, really. What can she want with me?" He turned to me, and the flush of controversy had passed and his face shone like the sun. It was not every day, I perceived, that Mrs. Verrall came to see him. "I get so many interruptions," he said, almost grinning. "You must excuse me a minute. Then I'll tell you about that fellow. But don't go. I pray you don't go. I can assure you, most interesting." He went out of the room, waving vague, prohibitory gestures. "I must go," I cried after him. No, in the passage. "I've got your answer." I think it was, he added, and quite mistaken. And I saw him running down the steps to talk to the old lady. I swore I made 3 steps to the window, and this brought me within a yard of that accursed drawer. I glanced at it, and then at that old woman who was so absolutely powerful, and instantly her son and Nettie's face were flaming in my brain. The stewards had, no doubt, already accepted accomplished facts, and I too. What was I doing here? What was I doing here while judgment escaped me? I woke up. I was injected with energy. I took one reassuring look at the curate's obsequious back, at the old lady's projected nose and quivering hand, and then with swift, clean movements, I had the little drawer open, 4 sovereigns in my pocket, and the drawer shut again. Then again at the window, they were still talking. That was all right. He might not look in that drawer for hours. I glanced at his clock. 20 minutes still before the Birmingham train. Time to buy a new pair of boots and get away, but how was I to get to the station? I went out boldly into the passage and took my hat and stick. Walk past him? Yes, that was all right. He could not argue with me while so important a person engaged him. I came boldly down the steps. I want a list made, Mr. Gabitas, of all the really deserving cases, old Mrs. Verrall was saying. It is curious, but it did not occur to me that here was a mother whose son I was going to kill. I did not see her in that aspect at all. Instead, I was possessed by a realization of the blazing imbecility of a social system that gave this palsied old woman the power to give or withhold the urgent necessities of life from hundreds of her fellow creatures, just according to her poor, foolish old fancies of desert. We could make a provisional list of that sort, he was saying, and glanced round with a preoccupied expression at me. I must go, I said at his flash of inquiry, and added, I'll be back in 20 minutes, and went on my way. He turned again to his patroness as though he forgot me on the instant. Perhaps after all he was not sorry. I felt extraordinarily cool and capable, exhilarated, if anything, by this prompt, effectual theft. After all, my great determination would achieve itself. I was no longer oppressed by a sense of obstacles. I felt I could grasp accidents and turn them to my advantage. I would go now down Hacker Street to the little shoemaker's, get a sound good pair of boots, 10 minutes, and then to the railway station, 5 minutes more, and off. I felt as efficient and non-moral as if I was Nietzsche's overman already come. It did not occur to me that the curate's clock might have a considerable margin of error. Book 1, Chapter 4, Section 6. I missed the train. Partly that was because the curate's clock was slow, and partly it was due to the commercial obstinacy of the shoemaker, who would try on another pair after I had declared my time was up. I bought the final pair, however, gave him a wrong address for the return of the old ones, and only ceased to feel like the Nietzschean overman when I saw the train running out of the station. Even then I did not lose my head. It occurred to me almost at once that in the event of a prompt pursuit, there would be a great advantage in not taking a train from Clayton. That, indeed, to have done so would have been an error from which only luck had saved me. As it was, I had already been very indiscreet in my inquiries about Champenberry. For once, on the scent, the clerk could not fail to remember me. Now the chances were against his coming into the case. I did not go into the station, therefore, at all. I made no demonstration of having missed the train, but walked quietly past, down the road, crossed the iron footbridge, and took the way back circuitously by White's brickfields and the allotments to the way over Clayton Crest to 2 Milestone, where I calculated I should have ample margin for the 6.13 train. I was not very greatly excited or alarmed. Then, suppose, I reasoned, that by some accident the curate goes to that drawer at once, will he be certain to miss 4 out of 10 or 11 sovereigns? If he does, will he at once think I have taken them? If he does, will he act at once or wait for my return? If he acts at once, will he talk to my mother or call the police? Then there are a dozen roads and even railways out of the Clayton region. How is he to know which I have taken? Suppose he goes straight at once to the right station. They will not remember my departure for the simple reason that I didn't depart. But they may remember about Champenberry. It was unlikely. I resolved not to go directly to Champenberry from Birmingham, but to go thence to Monkshampton, thence to Wyvern, and then come down to Champenberry from the north. That might involve a night at some intermediate stopping place, but it would effectually conceal me from any but the most persistent pursuit. And this was not a case of murder yet, but only the theft of 4 sovereigns. I had argued away all anxiety before I reached Clayton Crest. At the crest I looked back. What a world it was! And suddenly it came to me that I was looking at this world for the last time. If I overtook the fugitives and succeeded, I should die with them, or hang. I stopped and looked back more attentively at that wide, ugly valley. It was my native valley, and I was going out of it. I thought never to return, and yet in that last prospect, the group of towns that had borne me and dwarfed and crippled and had made me seemed in some indefinable manner strange. I was perhaps more used to seeing it from this comprehensive viewpoint when it was veiled and softened by night. Now it came all out in its weekday reek, under a clear afternoon sun. That may account a little for its unfamiliarity, and perhaps too there was something in the emotions through which I had been passing for a week and more, to intensify my insight, to enable me to pierce the unusual, to question the accepted. But it came to me then, I am sure, for the first time, how promiscuous, how higgledy-piggledy was the whole of that jumble of mines and homes, collieries and pot-banks, railway yards, canals, schools, forges and blast furnaces, churches, chapels, allotment hovels, a vast irregular agglomeration of ugly smoking accidents in which men lived as happy as frogs in a dustpan. Each thing jostled and damaged the other things about. Each thing ignored the other things about it. The smoke of the furnace defiled the pot-bank clay. The clatter of the railway deafened the worshippers in church. The public house thrust corruption at the school doors. The dismal home squeezed miserably amidst the monstrosities of industrialism, with an effect of groping imbecility. Humanity choked amidst its products, and all its energy went in increasing its disorder, like a blind, stricken thing that struggles and sinks in a morass. I did not think these things clearly that afternoon, much less did I ask how I, with my murderous purpose, stood to them all. I write down that realization of disorder and suffocation here and now as though I had thought it, but indeed, then I only felt it transitorily as I looked back, and then stood with the thing escaping from my mind. I should never see that countryside again. I came back to that. At any rate, I wasn't sorry. The chances were I should die in sweet air under a clean sky. From distant swathing Leah came a little sound, the minute undulation of a remote crowd, and then rapidly 3 shots. That held me perplexed for a space. Well, anyhow, I was leaving it all. Thank God I was leaving it all. Then, as I turned to go on, I thought of my mother. It seemed an evil world in which to leave one's mother. My thoughts focused upon her very vividly for a moment. Down there, under that afternoon light, she was going to and fro, unaware as yet that she had lost me, bent and poking about in the darkling underground kitchen, perhaps carrying a lamp into the scullery to trim, or sitting patiently, staring into the fire, waiting tea for me. A great pity for her, a great remorse at the blacker troubles that lowered over her innocent head came to me. Why, after all, was I doing this thing? Why? I stopped again dead, with the hill crest rising between me and home. I had more than half a mind to return to her. Then I thought of the curate's sovereigns. If he missed them already, what should I return to? And even if I returned, how could I put them back? And what of the night after I renounced my revenge? What of the time when young Verrall came back? And Nettie? No, the thing had to be done. But at least I might have kissed my mother before I came away, left her some message, reassured her at least for a little while. All night she would listen and wait for me. Should I send her a telegram from 2 Milestone? It was no good now. Too late, too late. To do that would be to tell the course I had taken, to bring pursuit upon me, swift and sure, if pursuit there was to be. No, my mother must suffer. I went on grimly toward 2 Milestone, but now as if some greater will than mine directed my footsteps thither. I reached Birmingham before darkness came, and just caught the last train for Monkshampton, where I had planned to pass the night. Book 1, Chapter 5, The Pursuit of the Two Lovers. Section 1. As the train carried me on from Birmingham to Monkshampton, it carried me not only into a country where I had never been before, but out of the commonplace daylight and the touch and quality of ordinary things, into the strange, unprecedented night that was ruled by the giant meteor of the last days. There was at that time a curious accentuation of the common alternation of night and day. They became separated, with a widening difference of value in regard to all mundane affairs. During the day, the comet was an item in the newspapers. It was jostled by 1,000 more living interests. It was as nothing in the skirts of the war storm that was now upon us. It was an astronomical phenomenon, somewhere away over China, millions of miles away in the deeps. We forgot it, but directly the sun sank one turned over ever again and again toward the east, and the meteor resumed its sway over us. One waited for its rising, and yet each night it came as a surprise. Always it rose higher than one dared to think, always larger and with some wonderful change in its outline. And now with a strange, less luminous, greener disk upon it that grew with its growth, the umbra of the earth. It shone also with its own light, so that the shadow was not hard or black, but it shone phosphorescently, and with a diminishing intensity where the stimulus of the sun's rays was withdrawn. As it ascended toward the zenith, as the last trailing daylight went after the abdicating sun, its greenish-white illumination banished the realities of day, diffused a bright ghostliness over all things. It changed the starless sky about it to an extraordinary deep blue, the profoundest color in the world, such as I have never seen before or since. I remember, too, that as I peered from the train that was rattling me along to Monkshampton, I perceived and was puzzled by a coppery red light that mingled with all the shadows that were cast by it. It turned our ugly English industrial towns to phantom cities. Everywhere the local authorities discontinued street lighting. One could read small print in the glare. And so at Monkshampton I went about through pale, white, unfamiliar streets whose electric globes had shadows on the path. Lit windows here and there burnt ruddy orange, like holes cut in some dream curtain that hung before a furnace. A policeman with noiseless feet showed me an inn woven in moonshine. A green-faced man opened to us, and there I abode the night. And the next morning it opened with a mighty clatter, and was a dirty little beer-house that stank of beer. And there was a fat and grimy landlord with red spots upon his neck, and much noisy traffic going by the cobbles outside. I came out, after I had paid my bill, and into a street that echoed to the bawlings of 2 news vendors and to the noisy yappings of a dog they had raised to emulation. They were shouting, "Great British disaster in the North Sea, a battleship lost with all hands." I bought a paper, went on to the railway station, reading such details as were given of this triumph of the old civilization, of the blowing up of this great iron ship, full of guns and explosives, and the most costly and beautiful machinery of which that time was capable, together with 900 able-bodied men, all of them above the average, by a contact mine towed by the German submarine. I read myself into a fever of warlike emotions. Not only did I forget the meteor, but for a time I forgot even the purpose that took me on to the railway station, bought my ticket, and was now carrying me onward to Champenberry. So the hot day came to its own again, and people forgot the night. Each night there shone upon us more and more insistently beauty, wonder, the promise of the deeps, and we were hushed and marveled for a space. And at the first grey sounds of dawn again, at the shooting of bolts and the noise of milk carts, we forgot, and the dusty habitual day came yawning and stretching back again. The stains of coal smoke crept across the heavens, and we rose to the soiled, disorderly routine of life. Thus life had always been, we said, thus it will always be. The glory of those nights was almost universally regarded as spectacular merely. It signified nothing to us. So far as Western Europe went, it was only a small and ignorant section of the lower classes who regarded the comet as a portent of the end of the world. Abroad, where there are peasantries, it was different, but in England the peasantry had already disappeared. Everyone read. The newspaper in the quiet days before our swift quarrel with Germany rushed to its climax had absolutely dispelled all possibilities of a panic in this matter. The very tramps upon the high roads, the children in the nursery, had learnt that the utmost, the whole of that shining cloud could weigh but for the few score tons. This fact had been shown quite conclusively by the enormous deflections that had at last swung it round squarely at our world. It had passed near 3 of the smallest asteroids without producing the minutest perceptible deflection in their course, while, on its own part, it had described a course through nearly 3 degrees. When it struck our Earth, there was to be a magnificent spectacle, no doubt, for those who were on the right side of our planet to see, but beyond that, nothing. It was doubtful whether we were on the right side. The meteor would loom larger and larger in the sky, but with the umbra of our Earth eating its heart of brightness out, and at last it would be the whole sky, a sky of luminous green clouds with a white brightness about the horizon, west and east. Then a pause of not very exactly definite duration, and then no doubt a great blaze of shooting stars. They might be of some unwanted color because of the unknown element that line in the green revealed. For a little while the zenith was spout shooting stars. Some, it was hoped, would reach the Earth and be available for analysis. That, science said, would be all. The green clouds would whirl and vanish, and there might be thunderstorms, but through the attenuated wisps of comet shine, the old sky, the old stars would reappear, and all would be as it had been before. And since this was to happen between 1 and 11 in the morning of the approaching Tuesday, I slept at Monkshampton at Saturday night. It would be only partially visible, if visible at all, on our side of the Earth. Perhaps if it came late, one would see no more than a shooting star low down in the sky. All this we had with the utmost assurances of science. Still, it did not prevent the last nights being the most beautiful and memorable of human experiences. The nights had become very warm, and when next day I had ranged Champenberry in vain, I was greatly tormented as that unparalleled glory of the night returned, to think that under its splendid benediction young Verrall and Nettie made love to one another. I walked backward and forward along the seafront, peering into the faces of the young couples who promenaded, with my hand in my pocket ready, and a curious ache in my heart that had no kindred with rage, until at last all the promenaders had gone home to bed, and I was alone with the star. My train from Wyvern to Champenberry that morning was a whole hour late. They said it was on account of the movement of troops to meet a possible raid from the Elbe. Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 2. Champenberry seemed an odd place to me even then, but something was quickening me at that time to feel the oddness of many accepted things. Now in the retrospect, I see it as intensely queer. The whole place was strange to my untraveled eyes. The sea even was strange. Only twice in my life had I been at the seaside before, and then I had gone by excursion to places on the Welsh coast whose great cliffs of rocks and mountain backgrounds made the effect of the horizon very different from what it is upon the East Anglian seaboard. Here, what they call a cliff was a crumbling bank of whitey-brown earth not 50 feet high. So soon as I arrived, I made a systematic exploration of Champenberry. To this day, I retain the clearest memories of the plan I shaped out then, and how my inquiries were incommoded by the overpowering desire of everyone to talk of the chances of a German raid before the Channel Fleet got round to us. I slept at the small public house in a Champenberry back street on Sunday night. I did not get on to Champenberry from Wyvern until 2 in the afternoon, because of the infrequency of Sunday trains, and I got no clue whatever until late in the afternoon of Monday. As the little local train bumped into sight of the place round the curve of a swelling hill, one saw a series of undulating grassy spaces, amidst which a number of conspicuous notice boards appealed to the eye and cut up the distant sea horizon. Many of these referred to comestibles or to remedies to follow the comestibles, and they were colored with a view to be memorable rather than beautiful, to stand out amidst the gentle grayish tones of the East Coast scenery. The greater number, I may remark, of the advertisements that were so conspicuous a factor in the life of those days, and which rendered our vast tree pulp newspapers possible, referred to foods, drinks, tobacco, and the drugs that promised a restoration of the equanimity these other articles had destroyed. Wherever one went was reminded in glaring letters that after all man was little better than a worm, that eyeless, earless thing that burrows and lives uncomplainingly amidst nutritious fruit, an alimentary canal with the subservient appendages thereto. But in addition to such boards, there were also the big black and white boards of various grandiloquently named estates. The individualistic enterprise of that time had led the plotting out of nearly all the country round the seaside towns into roads and building plots. All but a small portion of the south and east coast was in this condition, And had the promises of those schemes been realized, the entire population of the island might have been accommodated upon the sea frontiers. Nothing of the sort happened, of course. The whole of this uglification of the coastline was done to simulate the little foolish gambling and plots, and one saw everywhere agents' boards in every state of freshness and decay. Ill-made exploitation roads overgrown with grass, and here and there, at a corner, a label Trafalgar Avenue or Seaview Road. Here and there, too, some small investor, some shopman with savings, had delivered his soul to the local builders and built himself a house. And there it stood, ill-designed, mean-looking, isolated, ill-placed on a cheaply fenced plot, athwart which his domestic washing fluttered in the breeze amidst a bleak desolation of enterprise. Then presently our railway crossed a high road, and a row of mean yellow brick houses, workmen's cottages, and the filthy black sheds that made the allotments of that time a universal eyesore, marked our approach to the more central areas of, I quote the local guidebook, one of the most delightful resorts in the East Anglian Poppyland. Then more mean houses, the gaunt ungainliness of the electric force station. It had a huge chimney, because no one understood how to make combustion of coal complete. And then we were in the railway station, and barely 3/4 of a mile from the center of this haunt of health and pleasure. I inspected the town thoroughly before I made my inquiries. The road began badly, with a row of cheap, pretentious, insolvent-looking shops, a public house, and a cab stand. But after an interval of little red villas that were partly hidden amidst shrubbery gardens, broke into a confusedly bright but not unpleasing high street, shuttered that afternoon and sabbatically still. Somewhere in the background a church bell jangled, and children in bright, new-looking clothes were going to Sunday school. Thence through a square of stuccoed lodging houses that seemed a finer and cleaner version of my native square, I came to a garden of asphalt and Unimus, the seafront. I sat down on a cast-iron seat and surveyed first of all the broad stretches of muddy, sandy beach with its queer-wheeled bathing machines, painted with the advertisement of somebody's pills, and then at the house fronts that stared out upon these visceral councils, boarding houses, private hotels, and lodging houses and terraces clustered closely right and left of me, and then came to an end. In one direction, scaffolding marked a building enterprise in progress, and in the other, after a waste interval, rose a monstrous bulging red shape, a huge hotel that dwarfed all other things. Northward were low pale cliffs with white denticulations of tents, where the local volunteers, all under arms, lay encamped, and southward, a spreading waste of sandy dunes with occasional bushes and clumps of stunted pine, and an advertisement board or so. A hard blue sky hung all over this prospect, the sunshine cast inky shadows, and eastward was a whitish sea. It was Sunday, and the midday meal still held people indoors. A queer world, thought I even then. To you now it must seem impossibly queer, and after an interval I forced myself back to my own affair. How was I to ask? What was I to ask for? I puzzled for a long time over that. At first I was a little tired and indolent, and then presently I had a flow of ideas. My solution was fairly ingenious. I invented the following story. I happened to be taking a holiday in Champenberry, and I was making use of the opportunity to seek the owner of a valuable feather boa, which had been left behind in the hotel of my uncle at Wyvern by a young lady traveling with a young gentleman. No doubt a youthful married couple. They had reached Champenberry somewhen on Thursday. I went over the story many times and gave my imaginary uncle and his hotel plausible names. At any rate, this yarn would serve as a complete justification for all the questions I wished to ask. I settled that, but I still sat for a time wanting the energy to begin. Then I turned toward the big hotel. Its gorgeous magnificence seemed to my inexpert judgment to indicate the very place a rich young man of good family would select. Huge draught-proof doors were swung round for me by an ironically polite underporter in a magnificent green uniform, who looked at my clothes as if he listened to my question, and then with a German accent referred to me a gorgeous head porter, who directed me to a princely young man behind a counter of brass and polish, like a bank, like several banks. This young man, while he answered me, kept his eye on my collar and tie, and I knew they were abominable. "I want to find a lady and gentleman who came to Champenberry on Tuesday," I said. Friends of yours? He asked with a terrible fineness of irony. I made out at last that here at any rate the young people had not been. They might have lunched there, but they had had no room. But I went out, door opened again for me, obsequiously, in a state of social discomfiture, and did not attack any other establishment that afternoon. My resolution had come to a sort of ebb. More people were promenading, and their Sunday smartness abashed me. I forgot my purpose in an acute sense of myself. I felt that the bulge in my pocket caused by the revolver was conspicuous, and I was ashamed. I went along the seafront away from the town and presently lay among the pebbles and sea poppies. This mood of reaction prevailed with me all that afternoon. In the evening, about sundown, I went to the station and asked questions of the outporters there, but outporters, I found, were a class of men who remembered luggage rather than people, and I had no sort of idea what luggage young Verrall and Nettie were likely to have with them. Then I fell into conversation with the salacious, wooden-legged old man with a silver ring who swept the steps that went down to the beach from the parade. He knew about young couples, but only in general terms, and nothing of the particular young couple I sought. He reminded me in the most disagreeable way of the sensuous aspects of life, and I was not sorry when presently a gunboat appeared in the offing signaling the Coast Guard in the camp, and cut short his observations upon holidays, beaches, and morals. I went, and now I was past my ebb, and sat in a seat upon the parade and watched the brightening of those rising clouds of chilly fire that made the ruddy west seem tame. My midday lassitude was going, my blood was running warmer again, and as the twilight and that filmy brightness replaced the dusty sunlight and robbed this unfamiliar place of all its matter-of-fact queerness, its sense of aimless materialism, romance returned to me, and passion, and my thoughts, and of honor and revenge. I remember that change of mood was occurring very vividly on this occasion, but I fancy that less distinctly I had felt this before many times. In the old times, night and the starlight had an effect of intimate reality the daytime did not possess. The daytime, as one saw it in towns and populous places, had hold of one, no doubt, but only as an uproar might. It was distracting, conflicting, insistent. Darkness veiled the more salient aspects of those agglomerations of human absurdity, and one could exist, one could imagine. I had a queer illusion that night, that Nettie and her lover were close at hand, that suddenly I should come on them. I have already told how I went through the dusk seeking them in every couple that drew near, and I dropped asleep at last in an unfamiliar bedroom hung with gaudily decorated texts, cursing myself for having wasted a day. Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 3. I sought them in vain the next morning, but after midday I came in quick succession on a perplexing multitude of clues. After failing to find any young couple that corresponded to young Verrall and Nettie, I presently discovered an unsatisfactory quartet of couples. Any of these 4 couples might have been the one I sought. With regard to none of them was there conviction. They had all arrived either on Wednesday or Thursday. 2 couples were still in occupation of their rooms, but neither of these were at home. Late in the afternoon, I reduced my list by eliminating a young man in drab, with side whiskers and long cuffs, accompanied by a lady of 30 or more, of consciously ladylike type. I was disgusted at the sight of them. The other 2 young people had gone for a long walk, and though I watched their boarding house until the fiery clouds shone out above, sharing and mingling in an unusually splendid sunset, I missed them. Then I discovered them dining at a separate table in the bow window with red-shaped candles between them, peering out ever and again at this splendor that was neither night nor day. The girl in her pink evening dress looked very light and pretty to me, pretty enough to enrage me. She had well-shaped arms and white, well-modeled shoulders, and the turn of her cheek and the fair hair about her ears was full of subtle delights. But she was not Nettie. And the happy man with her was that odd degenerate type our old aristocracy produced with such odd frequency. Chinless, large bony nose, small fair head, languid expression, and a neck that had demanded and received a veritable sleeve of collar. I stood outside in the meteor's livid light, hating them and cursing them for having delayed me so long. I stood until it was evident they remarked me, a black shape of envy silhouetted against the glare. That finished Champenberry. The question I had now to debate was which of the remaining couples I had to pursue. I walked back to the parade, trying to reason my next step out, and muttering to myself because there was something in that luminous wonderfulness that touched one's brain and made one feel a little lightheaded. One couple had gone to London. The other couple had gone to the bungalow village at Bonecliff. Where, I wondered, was Bonecliff? I came upon my wooden-legged man at the top of his steps. "Hello," said I. He pointed seaward with his pipe. His silver ring shone in the skylight. "Rum," he said. "What is?" I asked. "Searchlights, smoke, ships going north. If it wasn't for this blasted Milky Way gone green up there, we might see." He was too intent to heed my questions for a time. Then he vouchsafed over his shoulder. "No bungalow village. Rather, artists and such. Nice goings on. Mixed bathing. Something scandalous, yes." "But where is it?" I said, suddenly exasperated. "There," he said. "What's that flicker? A gun flash? Or I'm a lost soul." "You'd hear," I said, "long before it was near enough to see a flash." He didn't answer. Only by making it clear I would distract him until he told me what I wanted to know could I get him to turn from his absorbed contemplation of that phantom dance between the sea rim and the shine. Indeed, I gripped his arm and shook him, then he turned upon me cursing. 7 miles, he said, along this road, and now go to hell with you." I answered with some foul insult by way of thanks, and so we parted, and I set off towards the bungalow village. I found a policeman standing stargazing a little way beyond the end of the parade, and verified the wooden-legged man's directions. "It's a lonely road, you know," he called after me. I had an odd intuition that now at last I was on the right track. I left the dark masses of Champenberry behind me, and pushed out into the dim pallor of the night, with the quiet assurance of a traveler who nears his end. The incidents of that long tramp I do not recall in any orderly succession. The one progressive thing is my memory of a growing fatigue. The sea was for the most part smooth and shining like a mirror, a great expanse of reflecting silver, barred by slow broad undulations, but at one time a little breeze breathed like a faint sigh and ruffled their long bodies into faint scaly ripples that never completely died out again. The way was sometimes sandy, thick with silvery colorless sand, and sometimes chalky and lumpy, with lumps that had shining facets. A black scrub was scattered, sometimes in thickets, sometimes in single bunches, among the somnolent hummocks of sand. At one place came grass, and ghostly great sheep looming up among the gray. After a time, black pine woods intervened and made sustained darknesses along the roads, woods that frayed out at the edges to weirdly warped and stunted trees. Then isolated pine witches would appear and make their rigid gestures at me as I passed. Grotesquely incongruous amidst these forms, I presently came on estate boards appealing. Houses can be built to suit purchaser, to the silence, to the shadows and the glare. Once I remember the persistent barking of a dog from somewhere inland of me, and several times I took out and examined my revolver very carefully. I must of course have been full of my intention when I did that. I must have been thinking of Nettie and revenge, but I cannot now recall those emotions at all. Only I see again very distinctly the greenish gleams that ran over lock and barrel as I turned the weapon in my hand. Then there was the sky, the wonderful luminous, starless, moonless sky, and the empty blue deeps of the edge of it, between the meteor and the sea, and once strange phantoms. I saw far out upon the shine, and very small and distant, 3 long black warships, without masts or sails or smoke or any lights, dark and deadly, furtive things, traveling very swiftly and keeping an equal distance. And when I looked again, they were very small, and then the shine had swallowed them up. Then once a flash and what I thought was a gun, until I looked up and saw a fading trail of greenish light still hanging in the sky. And after that there was a shiver and whispering in the air, a stronger throbbing in one's arteries, a sense of refreshment, a renewal of purpose. Somewhere upon my way the road forked, but I do not remember whether there was Champenberry or near the end of my walk. The hesitation between 2 rutted unmained roads alone remains clear in my mind. At last I grew weary. I came to piled heaps of decaying seaweed and cart tracks running this way and that, and then I had missed the road and was stumbling among sand hummocks quite close to the sea. I came out on the edge of the dimly glittering sandy beach, and something phosphorescent drew me to the water's edge. I bent down and peered at the little luminous specks that floated in the ripples. Presently, with a sigh, I stood erect and contemplated the lonely peace of that last wonderful night. The meteor had now trailed its shining nets across the whole space of the sky and was beginning to set. In the east, the blue was coming to its own again. The sea was an intense edge of blackness. And now, escaped from that great shine and faint and still tremulously valiant, one weak elusive star could just be seen, hovering on the verge of the invisible. How beautiful it was, how still and beautiful. Peace, peace. The peace that passeth understanding, robed in light descending. My heart swelled, and suddenly I was weeping. There was something new and strange in my blood. It came to me that indeed I did not want to kill. I did not want to kill. I did not want to be the servant of my passions any more. A great desire had come to me to escape from life, from the daylight which is heat and conflict and desire, into that cool night of eternity and rest. I had played. I had done. I stood upon the edge of the great ocean. I was filled with an inarticulate spirit of prayer, and I desired greatly peace from myself. And presently there in the east would come again the red discoloring curtain over these mysteries, the finite world again, the grey and growing harsh certainties of dawn. My resolve, I knew, would take up with me again. This was a rest for me, an interlude, but tomorrow I should be William Ledford once more, ill-nourished, ill-dressed, ill-equipped, and clumsy, a thief and shamed, a wound upon the face of life, a source of trouble and sorrow even to the mother I loved. No hope in life left for me now but revenge before my death. Why this paltry thing, revenge? It entered into my thoughts that I might end the matter now and let these others go. I wade out into the sea, into this warm lapping that mingled the natures of water and light, to stand there, breast high, to thrust my revolver into my mouth. Why not? I swung about with an effort. I walked slowly up to the beach, thinking. I turned and looked back to the sea. No, something within me said. No, I must think. I was troublesome to go further because the hummocks and the tangled bushes began. I sat down amidst a black cluster of shrubs and rested chin on hand. I drew my revolver from my pocket and looked at it, and held it in my hand. Life or death? It seemed to be probing the very deeps of being, but indeed imperceptibly I fell asleep and sat dreaming. Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 4. 2 people were bathing in the sea. I had awakened. It was still that white and wonderful night, and the blue band of clear sky was no wider than before. These people must have come into sight as I fell asleep, and awakened me almost at once. They waded breast deep in the water, emerging, coming shoreward, a woman with her hair coiled about her head, and in pursuit of her a man, graceful figures of black and silver, with a bright green surge flowing off from them, a pattering of flashing wavelets about them. He smote the water and splashed it toward her. She retaliated, and then they were knee-deep, and then for an instant their feet broke the long silver margin of the sea. Each wore a tightly fitting bathing dress that hid nothing of the shining, dripping beauty of their youthful forms. She glanced over her shoulder and found him nearer than she thought, started, gesticulated, gave a little cry that pierced me to the heart, and fled up the beach obliquely toward me, running like the wind and past me, vanished amidst the black distorted bushes, and she was gone, she and her pursuer in a moment over the ridge of sand. I heard him shout, between exhaustion and laughter, and suddenly I was a thing of bestial fury, standing up with hands up and clenched, rigid in gesture of impotent threatening against the sky, for this striving, swift thing of light and beauty was Nettie, and this was the man for whom I had been betrayed. And it blazed upon me. I might have died there by the sheer ebbing of my will, unavenged. In another moment I was running and stumbling, revolver in my hand, in quiet, unsuspected pursuit of them, through the soft and noiseless sand. Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 5. I came up over the little ridge and discovered the bungalow village I had been seeking, nestling in a crescent lap of dunes. A door slammed, the 2 runners had vanished, and I halted, staring. There was a group of 3 bungalows nearer to me than the others. Into one of these 3 they had gone, and I was too late to see which. All had doors and windows carelessly open, and none showed a light. This place upon which I had last opened was a fruit of the reaction of artistic-minded and carelessly living people against the costly and uncomfortable social stiffness